this lecture rolling, this Rotman lecture, and I'm particularly happy, on a personal plane, to be introducing Moira Howes to you. Moira did her PhD here a dozen years ago or so with me, and it was a fascinating adventure. I suppose that a sort of ordinary, mildly educated person like me has a rough idea of the immune system. What it's there for is just to defend the self, fight off the aliens. But of course, what Moira quickly pointed out in her thesis was that in fact the immune system creates the self, decides what is self and what isn't. And that seemed to me to be an utterly postmodern twist in biology, and I was absolutely delighted. Since that time, Moira has been teaching at the University of Buffalo, and more recently and more permanently at Trent University, where she's now chair of the philosophy department. And some of her recent work, which I understand some of you know fairly well, has been exploring relationships between the immune system and the human reproductive system. And that, broadly, is the subject of her lecture this afternoon. Moira.
Thank you very much, John. I'm delighted to be back at Western. I am very grateful for this opportunity to speak in your Rotman Institute lecture series. You have such terrific lecturers throughout the year. It's really, really wonderful. And it's a delight to see how Western philosophy has bloomed. It's just flourishing. So thank you very much for inviting me to speak. The image above is an image of an embryonic trophoblast cell. That's the very large cell taking up most of the frame. And in the top right, a uterine natural killer cell. And these two cells are interacting with each other, and Pippa Kennedy, the graduate student at the University of Cambridge who created the image, can tell you more about what exactly they're doing. There have been many discoveries in recent times about the interaction between the maternal immune system and embryonic cells in human pregnancy. And many of these recent discoveries focus on beneficial interactions between these cells. Originally, it was thought that interactions between the maternal immune system and fetal embryonic cells would be antagonistic, and so the maternal immune system would have to be suppressed in order to prevent interaction between these very immunologically distinct individuals. Human pregnancy is unique amongst mammals with respect to the extent of the interconnection between fetal and maternal cells. And I think this image is very apt. It shows that indeed the connection between these cells are very close. And this raises a number of questions about the plausibility that the relationship between the mother's immune cells and fetal cells is one best described by antagonism. I've written about concepts of maternal agency that are involved in models of pregnancy immunology. But today I'm actually concerned with epistemic agency, and in particular highly individualistic understandings of epistemic agency. I'm going to make use of some ideas from virtue epistemology, especially ideas about epistemic trustworthiness and epistemic trust, to think about the question of what I'll call hyper-individualism in epistemic agency and its effect on reasoning with regard to this particular case. Because individualism is so intense in the case of immunological and evolutionary models of human female sexuality and reproduction, I think this case provides an especially good example of the sort of epistemic problem that I want to describe and challenge. I will say, though, that my thesis today is very much a working thesis. I've had a very heavy year of administration, and I fear that my brain might be a little bit addled. So I'm lifting up a rock to see what is underneath. And my hope is that you, epistemically trustworthy Western types, will tell me if I should quickly turn over this rock, put it back down, if it doesn't look like it's going to be a very promising approach. Okay. So the problem I'm going to look at today is this. Evolutionary accounts of human female sexuality and reproduction, including the few that explicitly refer to immune function, typically ignore infection as a selection pressure, and they tend to employ single-factor causal explanations, or explanations that really give primacy to one particular factor of causal relevance in the evolutionary story. So I'm interested in looking at this particular problem, and just to give you a couple of examples. The first is Randy Thornhill and Stephen Gangstad's 2008 The Evolutionary Biology of Human Female Sexuality, which is an extensive and in-depth work on the topic. This is a particularly interesting book because the problem of infection is mentioned only briefly, and it's mentioned in the context of attractiveness, which is defined roughly as symmetry. And they explore a hypothesis that immune system activation during development causes asymmetries, physical asymmetries, and these advertise negative things about your genes to potential mates. And they tend to focus on an ultimate single factor in their evolutionary explanation. And this is that the most important thing driving the evolution of human female sexuality is differential investment in offspring by males and females. They argue that women use a dual strategy for reproduction. They have one strategy for the period of extended sexuality when they are not fertile, and this strategy is to go after men that have resources. And they have another strategy during the fertile phase of the cycle, which is to go after men who have good genes. And good genes appear to be defined in terms of things like symmetry, masculine-looking faces, shoulder to waist ratio, and things like this. The principal idea behind this differential investment is that there's going to be conflict between males and females over resources. And they talk about this conflict a little bit more in connection with immunology when they explore what they call their training hypothesis, which is the idea that males through their semen try to train the female reproductive immune system to accept their sperm preferentially. The conflict between males and females is brought down to the immunological level between the maternal, the woman's immune system and the man's sperm. Another example where infection is not part of the immunological evolutionary story is a recent paper on the evolution of menstruation. And they developed a new argument for an idea that menstruation, an idea that's been around for a while, that menstruation is a byproduct of a function that was selected for. And in this case, the idea is that menstruation is a byproduct of stromal decidualization, the proliferation of the interior wall of the uterus, and they claim that it proliferates early in women so as to form a protective barrier against the highly aggressive, invasive human embryo. And that's terminology that they use that I've sort of taken up in my work on maternal agency in the area. So they see it as being, the evolution of menstruation as being a sort of single factor phenomenon related to this need for protectiveness. And they dismiss very briskly accounts of menstruation that involve the idea of pathogen defense, that menstruation may have had some kind of a role in protecting their female reproductive system against infection. I will come back to that idea in a moment. So these examples, they get close to immunology, but they don't pick up on the idea of infection and explore it fully. They tend to be looking more at this idea of conflict either between males and females or females and their fetuses. We can offer some interesting historical and sociological explanations for this state of affairs. I'm going to leave that to other people. But I just want to mention that there are issues of disciplinary boundaries that play a role here, and also practical objectives. In microbiology and immunology, there's been work on the vaginal mucosa and the kind of immunological factors that are involved in protecting females against infection. That work is not very developed when compared to work on respiratory epithelium and intestinal epithelial immune functions, but there is some work in that area. The work in reproductive immunology, however, tends to focus on the question of fertility. So there is some connection between the fields. But reproductive immunology really tends to focus on pragmatic issues of addressing fertility issues and infertility. Evolutionary biology is largely concerned with things like mate choice, competition for mates, maternal-fetal conflicts, parent-offspring conflicts, and male-female conflicts, so things stemming from Schreiber's parental investment model. Reproductive immunology, just to focus on that for a moment, to sort of explain the history here is relevant. The animal scientist Peter Hansen said recently that reproductive immunology was born in the barnyard. I thought that was a terrific quotation and certainly apt. Ideas about maternal-fetal immunological conflict were studied in cows with Peter Medawar's work. Owen's work on immunological tolerance, which is a phenomenon where if you introduce the tissues of another organism early enough in development, that organism will be tolerant of those foreign immunological tissues. So that work was done in cows. And also, Rowson's work on embryo transfer was done in cows. He was very interested for reasons of farming that to learn how to do embryo transfer in cows. And he found, and this was around mid-last century, that it's not good to transfer cow embryos when progesterone levels are high because progesterone downregulates uterine antibacterial defenses. And I'm going to come back to that point in a little bit. So reproductive immunology has a lot of ties with the fertility industry, both veterinary and human. So that helps to explain, I think, a little bit about some of the disconnect we get between work on evolutionary work concerning immunology and infection. All right. Well, there are excellent reasons to consider infection in the evolutionary picture. Sperm-borne pathogens can deliver infectious agents directly into the interior of the body. The consequences of infections of the reproductive tract are serious: infertility, death. Infections are thought to be involved in preeclampsia, very serious hypertensive condition, of pregnancy, and the list goes on. So there's clearly evolutionary relevance there. Women have a variety of immunological defense systems in the reproductive tract. There are different things going on in the uterus, different things going on in the cervix. There's a whole host of different overlapping immunological defenses. So clearly they are relevant in the evolutionary story. Immune regulation changes throughout pregnancy and after childbirth. So the immune system is having to balance the roles that it plays in growth and development of the placenta and fetus with fighting infection. So all of that has to be coordinated at the same time and in changing hormonal circumstances. As I've mentioned, progesterone downregulates immunity, and it's interesting that that idea wasn't picked up in the context of evolutionary stories about menstruation, because progesterone rises during the luteal phase of women's cycles. That means that their immune systems might be functioning differently during that time, or women might be more vulnerable to sexually transmitted infection at that time. It's possible that menstruation, the sloughing that's involved, could act as an additional source of pathogen defense at that time. So I think it's interesting that it's so summarily dismissed in evolutionary work. A group of researchers at McMaster have done some really neat stuff with progesterone and sexually transmitted infection relationship. One of the striking things that I've learned is that if you treat mice with Depo-Provera, a progesterone-based contraceptive, that you will increase their susceptibility to herpes simplex 2 by 100 times. So there are possibly very great implications for women's health related to this issue. And of course, the last factor, I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this, is that monogamy was unlikely in the environment of evolutionary adaptation. We're not strict monogamists right now, but there seems to be quite an assumption of something near monogamy for women in our evolutionary history. And I don't know that work in anthropology supports this, the incredible variation in different marital arrangements in the last 5,000 years, the differences in sexuality between foraging societies versus agriculturalists suggests that there have been all kinds of arrangements involving different numbers of sexual partners and that sort of thing. And then there's the whole question of how we can get accurate information about our evolutionary ancestry in this area. Clearly, some evolutionary thinkers have thought infection is important at certain times. Martin Daly, the evolutionary psychologist in the 1970s, identified disease transmission as one of the costs of mating. This is all he says about it in the article. He spends a lot more time talking about other costs of mating related to conflict between males and females and so on. And what's particularly fascinating about this is that he wrote a review of Thornhill and Ganstad's book just recently, and he doesn't talk about infection at all in this review, not even to mention, its notable absence from the work altogether. I'm going to come back to that review a little bit later, but I just thought that was quite interesting. Charles Nunn, a biological anthropologist, has done some work on promiscuity in the primate immune system. This study was published in Science, where he found a relationship between leukocyte counts and that they were greater in species where primate species where females have more mating partners, indicating that the risk of sexually transmitted infection is likely to be a major factor in differences in primate immune systems. I love that he's asking this question and looking at it. What's really interesting about this study is that we get sampling information about the primates. He used primates from zoos, but there's no discussion about whether the levels of leukocytes he found were just naturally in the primates, regardless of their environment, or how they related to environment. Were these female primates actually sexually active in the zoos? If they were they under stress? If they weren't, were they under stress? All of these things can affect leukocyte counts. He then goes on to say that they looked at the human case, and they found that the leukocyte counts were more consistent with monogamy, but no sample information is given at all. It's nothing. That's all that you get in this article in Science. So I had certain questions. For example, did they sample women who were practicing monogamy, or did they sample, was there variety in the sample, how representative it was? So there's some interesting issues there. Christina Drea has taken up a number of problems stemming from evolutionary models that concern conflict, as well as the assumption that females do not benefit from additional mates in terms of reproductive success. And this goes back to a paper in 1948 by A.J. Bateman. It's a fascinating paper because, as Drea points out, his research actually showed two things. For 2 of the 6 runs of fruit fly mating, the results were that increased number of mates in females don't enhance reproductive success. But for 4 of the 6 runs, he found that multiple matings of females did increase reproductive success, and in fact it almost doubled. But what got picked up from Bateman's article was the idea that females just don't increase reproductive success as a result of multiple matings. So she goes through a lot of evidence to show that these sorts of ideas, male promiscuity versus female monandry, are highly problematic. And the article is quite densely packed with good arguments. Well, if our evolutionary ancestors did have multiple relationships, then infection is going to be a more serious concern. The only way you can avoid it is to do the abstinence and one partner for life kind of thing, and hope that your partner is doing the very same thing. There are some recent exceptions of work that actually manages to bring infection into the picture, along with the idea of immune relationships between mother and fetus and between women and men, with evolutionary arguments. The first is from the field of anthropology. They're looking mainly at energy expenditure in relation of the energy expenditure of reproduction in relation to the energy involved in protecting yourself immunologically. Moore and Cardenas have a wonderful article that addresses exactly what I dream of, that they look at the context of fighting infection in the human female reproductive tract together with pregnancy, and there's some other immunologists who are starting to do that too. And then Sarah Robertson's piece looks at the idea that the immune system is involved in quality control. We know that the immune system is involved in conception and in embryo implantation. The question about how exactly it's involved is there. But she looks at this and she talks about infection a little bit in this context too. Just in case you weren't feeling too hopeful, I thought I would throw those in there. There's an engagement with multiple factors that's attractive in these articles, and you start to get a different sense of female agency, biological agency in these accounts. Okay. Well, my question is, why is this obviously relevant evolutionary factor, infection, ignored or under-discussed in these scientific accounts? I have given you some possible historical and sociological explanations. There are arguments in feminist philosophy of biology and feminist sociobiology that apply here. I've argued in a different paper that emotions and intellectual virtues are involved in scientific salience, the process by which scientists are interested in some things versus others. But today I want to focus on the question of agency, finally here, to try and get at another aspect of this problem. My definition of agency is very relaxed. It includes metaphorical uses of the term all the way to things involving conscious choice. I'm focused mainly on very individualistic understandings of agency, so I'm not getting into relational autonomy and relational agency, which doesn't have the problems that I'm discussing here. So we have biological kinds of agency. What is the sexual agency of female primates? Are they assertive? Are they passive? We have all of the moral and cultural and political and economic ideas about agency. If we have schemas for good mothers and schemas for promiscuous women, and we associate good mothers with evolutionary success and promiscuous women with infection, we're going to have problems getting these areas to overlap, where we start to consider immune function in the good mothers as relevant. And epistemic agency, which is my focus today. Each of these concepts of agency, I argue, is linked with the idea that we're highly individualistic agents, and in the case of women, that we're passive agents. And I think these different conceptions of agency are knotted together. And we end up with a sort of associated knot of what I'll call hyper-individualism. And I think this is linked to the exclusion of infection from the evolutionary accounts I'm interested in. Hyper-individualism in immunology relates to the idea of self-known self-discrimination. Many immunologists have problems with this concept because, of course, there are many non-self things that the immune system doesn't care about and will not react to. And so some immunologists have argued that there should be other metaphors guiding immunological modeling, like danger, the danger not dangerous distinction. And this sort of hyper-individualism relates very much to the idea of conflict between mother and fetus, and between the maternal and paternal. In evolutionary theory, Mary Midgley has taken issue with focus on individualism in evolutionary theory and associated ideas of conflict between individuals, competition and aggression. And passivity, the ideas of passivity come up with the idea of immunosuppression in pregnant females, and also with the idea of female choice in evolutionary theory. In a recent paper, Carla Fair, this just came out in Hypatia, talks about how when she first learned about Shriver's parental investment model, she thought it was sort of an improvement over understandings of female agency from the humanities, where females were either completely ignored or they were sort of conceptualized as very passive. Whereas in Shriver's model, females choice is very important because they're going to try and choose the best male because they're putting all of their eggs in one basket, so to speak. And so it was at least better than prevailing accounts. But of course, the kind of choice that is conceptualized here is really restricted. It sort of involves, waiting to see which male is the best or wins the competition and then picking him. Well, Mary Midgley brings some of these ideas together with certain methodological problems in science. In The Solitary Self, she challenges what she calls the Hobbesian view that each individual citizen must be considered as wholly separate, a unit entirely devoted to its own safety. And she's criticizing a tendency in contemporary evolutionary theory to sort of focus on the individual at the expense of other relations, and she thinks this departs from what Darwin originally intended. But I think that this view applies equally well, or perhaps better, to some of the work that's gone on in immunology. And she connects this up with methodology, with perhaps unsurprising remark that anyone can become clearer by becoming more abstract, by ignoring certain ranges of facts. But when the whole world is there waiting to be understood, it is oddly perverse to ignore facts just for the sake of looking pure and acquiring a physics-like luster. Women fit problematically into this picture. If they're assumed to be passive, they're going to be seen as sort of inadequate in defending their unity. And we see this in the case of the idea of immunosuppression in pregnant women, that they're just not functioning at their best. They're not defending their borders as they should be. And it also, fails to fit because during pregnancy, women are sort of more like liminal beings in relation to this sort of Hobbesian perspective, if we take out Midgley's interpretation. And so they don't fit this idea of a perfect unity very well. And one of the things that I want to do is relate this to some of the sort of simplistic and acontextual accounts of the evolution of the human female reproductive tract that have been going on. Midgley herself does relate these two things. She says that social atavism is a combination of the deep individualism of our time and a prejudice about method. A general idea that it is always more scientific to consider separate components than the larger whole to which they belong. Indeed, it is often believed that those larger wholes are actually less real. There is no such thing as society. So, these ideas that Midgley is putting together reflect key arguments that we find in social and feminist epistemologies. And what I hope to do here is to build on these arguments in a way that's slightly different. Social and feminist epistemologists have argued that one of the problems in accounts like these, and indeed in science generally, is that we often fail to notice the social context of knowers and the relevance of diversity in knowers to knowledge production. So Lorraine Code, for example, in her book Ecological Thinking, is concerned with atomistic individualism, according to which solitary individuals extracted from the particulars of situation and place can claim knowledge. The other failure identified is a failure to notice diversity, complexity, and to use Longinus's term, mutuality and interaction in nature. And this is where we get into sort of the single-factor causal models that Evelyn Fox Keller criticized, for example, and the idea that the gene is the master molecule, that somehow it is more fundamental and basic, and that the other interactions sort of follow in ascending order from there. So I think the points that Midgley is making map roughly onto these arguments from feminist and social epistemology. And what I'd like to do is try to say a little bit more about the relationship between these two problems, the hyper-individualism of the knower and the failure to notice things like mutuality of interaction in nature. Certainly, feminists have said, these things are linked in terms of, we take social hierarchies and we sort of implant them on our understanding of nature. And of course, there are all value-based arguments. Value-laden assumptions are to play a role. And back in the day, they had psychoanalytic arguments that would connect these two problems as well. My working thesis is that hyper-individualistic beliefs about ourselves as epistemic agents constitute a psychological schema. By schema, I'm just sort of picking up a common understanding in psychology that these are automatic cognitive processes that allow us to reason or do things without effortful cognitive processing. There are schemas for stereotypes and social roles, and there's a lot of discussion in feminist philosophy right now making use of the idea of schemas. There are also schemas related to evaluative standards concerning learning. So there are schemas about the nature of epistemic agents and the nature of the epistemic enterprise. And psychologists have been looking at these questions both in terms of lay epistemics and the epistemics of students. But I think some of their findings apply to academics as well. Schemas are important because they focus our attention on certain things and cause us to miss relevant information in the environment. Not much hangs on the use of the term schema for me. I'm not really committed to it. If you prefer to think about sort of a systematically related collection of implicit biases, I would be just as happy. Okay, so these beliefs form a psychological schema, and through this schema, I'm still in my working hypothesis here, we read hyper-individualism and assumptions about the simplicity of knowledge into biological explanations. We undermine epistemic trust, the social epistemic relation most needed to correct it. We limit the development of intellectual virtue in epistemic communities. And last, we constrain our intellectual ability, which is a very polite way of saying that social atomism might be making us stupid. So it's not just that we undervalue cooperation in community or complexity in our evolutionary explanations. It's not just that we undervalue ecological thinking or that we fail to recognize that social relationships are important in knowledge acquisition. It's not just that we engage in epistemic practices that are epistemically unjust or involve motivated ignorance. I think that all of those things are very important and good arguments. I'm arguing that it also concerns schemas about the nature of epistemic phenomena. And I think that these connect hyper-individualism arising in biology, morality, economics, epistemics, with overly simplistic and acontextual models of science. Okay, so now I'm just going to talk about some support for this hypothesis. It's a working hypothesis, but not entirely unsupported. I'm drawing some strength and virtue of epistemology. I wrote a paper recently linking the objectivity of persons to something I call community intellectual virtue. In this paper, there are sort of two competing ideas of objectivity, and I sort of stay neutral with regard to them. Some virtue epistemologists think of objectivity, the objectivity of persons, as an intellectual virtue in and of itself. I tend to lean more towards the idea that objectivity of persons is sort of a categorical term for a suite of intellectual virtues that promote objectivity, like fair-mindedness, open-mindedness, intellectual courage, intellectual humility, thoroughness, and so on. But I argue that the development of intellectual character is a social process. Probably not a lot of us would disagree with that, but there's some really elegant and lovely work in virtue ethics and virtue epistemology concerning that. So I think we should avoid thinking of intellectual character in highly atomistic terms, highly individualistic terms. And I argue in that paper that it's a problem that a lot of our education in the intellectual virtues is tacit and implicit. I think that's an important way to learn the intellectual virtues, but it's very incomplete. I think we underemphasize the importance of teaching people about intellectual virtues and helping them learn how to exercise them. So my goal in that paper is to sort of promote the idea of community intellectual virtue and its relation to objectivity. Now, epistemic trust is really the glue that holds a lot of intellectually virtuous social relationships together. The virtue epistemologist Linda Zagzebski has argued that idealizations of epistemic autonomy have negative consequences for epistemic trust of others. We trust ourselves epistemically more than we do other people, it seems to be almost, for us at least, a somewhat natural tendency. Yet we don't have good reasons for this preference. We know that we're all wrong at times, that we can be epistemically untrustworthy sources of information. So she says that we don't have reason to prefer idealizations of epistemic autonomy over idealizations of epistemic dependence on trustworthy others. I mean, both idealizations are problematic, but we really don't have good reason to prefer the autonomy one over the dependence one. So we need to look more closely at this particular problem. Nancy Dowkis, in a terrific paper, says, epistemic trustworthiness is a social epistemic virtue, insofar as it depends on appropriate attitudes towards others, as well as towards oneself as epistemic agents. Another way in which it is a social epistemic virtue is that the character traits and skills required for epistemic trustworthiness are developed over time through social interaction with others in the context of normative social practices. This idea works with the second source of support that I'm looking to for my paper, and the support comes from educational psychology. Belief in cognitive independence, in our cognitive independence, and the simplicity of knowledge, the ultimate simplicity of knowledge, negatively associates with the ability to evaluate epistemic trustworthiness and the ability to integrate multiple sources of information coherently and meaningfully, or at least it appears to. And I think that these ideas from virtue epistemology concerning epistemic trust are now linking up in important ways with the idea that we have problematic schemas concerning the nature of the epistemic enterprise. Kruglansky found that a high need for cognitive closure positively correlates with high confidence in self-ascribed epistemic authority. I am generally right, or if it is my judgment, then it is correct. Now, the desire for cognitive closure can be motivating, it can be a good thing, certainly, but frequently the need for cognitive closure has an adverse effect on reasoning. It stops inquiry in its tracks, often prematurely, and it can be intellectually vicious. It can involve closed-mindedness, carelessness, arrogance, intellectual cowardice, and so on. So the work in educational psychology leads me to wonder, are schemes for social atomism making us stupid? So bringing my working thesis back to the case of hand. Highly individualistic schemas of epistemic agency may restrict our conceptualization of the biological, immunological, moral, and epistemic agency of our evolutionary ancestors. The social context of our evolutionary ancestors and the microbial relationships this entails. I just read something about the clouds of microbes that people create when they walk into a room. I just think of what's going on in here. And I also think it might restrict our conceptualization of the complex multiple selection pressures on human female sexuality and reproduction. So, this knot of hyper-individuality, I hope, might be a Gordian one. Perhaps if we can change the schemas or systematically related implicit biases for lay and academic epistemics, we might find that this knot releases. And we might be able to do this by working more on relations of epistemic trust and the intellectual virtues that are required for the development and maintenance of that trust. How might this play out in the case at hand? Well, Carla Fair, in this recent Acacia paper, argues very reasonably that to improve engagement between evolutionary psychologists and feminists and other critics of their work, we need to make improvements in our professional practices, work on our tone, and increase collaboration. This is especially crucial, she says, when the critic is, quote, seen as a hostile outsider to the research community, end quote. So feminist philosophers need to think about, quote, the venues where they disseminate their work, the audiences for whom they write, and their style of argumentation, quote. And adding to this, I think what we need to do is find ways to build relationships of epistemic trust that run counter to hyper-individualistic cognitive epistemic schemas and how they underline that epistemic trust. So I think there's an opening here for greater discussion between philosophers and scientists about virtue and epistemic trust. Like most scientists, evolutionary psychologists and biologists like Daly and Thornhill and Gangstad are concerned about epistemic virtue. I would say deeply concerned about it. Daly, in his review of Thornhill and Gangstad, says, In making a case for these views, the authors provide an impressively up-to-date, thorough, and even-handed review, not only of recent work on human sexuality, but also relevant research in these other areas. I've just highlighted the virtue epistemic terms that they're using there. A lot of people disagree. I think that Thornhill and Gangstad's book is thorough and even-handed. There's a number of complaints about how Elizabeth Boyd's work on the evolution of orgasm is treated in that book, and they're certainly missing out on discussion of feminist critiques of biology. But Daly is clearly concerned with virtue epistemic matters, and so are Thornhill and Gangstad. And in fact, in their introduction is sprinkled with virtue epistemic terms. The scientific investigation of women's sexuality has a noble history. That stopped my heart momentarily, but they seem committed to that idea. I think there's some flaws there, but they talk about the dedicated pursuit of truth, which is really very virtuous, of women's sexual design and phylogenetic origins of that design. And then they say that, as in all histories of scientific discovery, errors have been made. Mistakes were made, but not by us. I think that they're trying to sort of minimize a certain level of responsibility because evolutionary psychologists have been so, and sociobiologists have been so severely criticized for gender bias. They also talk about their own thesis as being bold, so they display intellectual courage, and yet at the same time it's well-grounded in empirical findings, and so they're being intellectually cautious. And then finally they say that they know they're disagreeing with received wisdom, and that this calls for humility. So I think that there's a lot of openness to discussion of intellectual virtue and epistemic trust that hasn't been exploited in conversations that might be in working towards solutions to some of these recalcitrant or recurring mistakes in work concerning the evolutionary biology of women's reproductive systems and the question of immunity therein. There's a lot of nice work to build on now. Sandra Mitchell's Unsimple Truths. I think Sandra Mitchell was here recently, yes. And Heather Douglas's work on values in science and science policy, and of course Carla Fair's work on getting disciplines to talk to one another. If none of that works, vanity might. We might put vice into the service of virtue. If implicit biases or schemata associated with highly individualized versions of epistemic agency are associated with weaker cognitive performance, people might be more willing to abandon them. So I think there's much upon which to develop better understandings of agency based in more socialized conceptions, and we can use epistemic trust and intellectual virtue towards this end. And perhaps if we do this, we'll finally be able to overcome some of these errors about reasoning concerning women's evolutionary past.
Thank you, Moira. So, questions? Yes, please, at the back.
Well, being the only immunologist here, I have to really ask some fundamental issues around the immune system and the evolutionary context you mentioned. And I think first half of your talk was very much related to what immunologists think. In the second half, I'm lost because I can't connect to it. I'm sure there's a disconnect between the two. Maybe I don't understand, maybe you can explain it. But let me start with the initial model, which you are very elegantly presented, the self, non-self. And I think that's the fundamental basis of the immune system. And I think you mentioned the point that the immune system defines what is self and non-self. It's a very elegant model. But then we, in the last maybe 10 years, 20 years, we have come to the danger model, which I think you also mentioned, that the danger defines what is self and non-self. So can you explain a bit more from your point of view the difference between danger versus what the immune system defines self and non-self?
I think then, early conceptions of self-non-self discrimination in immunology were much more, shall we say, highly individualistic in nature, that they seem to describe a very strong form of individuality sort of against all else. And certainly there have been changes in immunological understanding of that concept and its importance to immunological modeling over time. And one of the things that I looked at was the idea that the self that is created, and this is going back some years, is not a self as we might describe it in these sort of purely abstract individualistic terms, but in fact the self is blurrier. It's less distinct from its surroundings than some of the philosophical or religious conceptions would suggest. And so I really challenged a certain understanding of individuality at the same time that I looked at the immune system's creation of some kind of blurry self. And I used the work in immunology to sort of inform some of the work in philosophy. Now, the danger model, my understanding of it is that, certainly on Matzinger's account, that self kind of, it doesn't completely drop out, but it's very, very much minimized as a concept. And that really the immune system is concerned with whether something's dangerous or not. And it doesn't matter whether that dangerous thing is of self-origin or of non-self origin. So in the case of pregnancy immunology, the fetus is not dangerous, so the immune system is not interested in the fetus. And, I think they even thought early on that the female immune system, sort of didn't even know that the fetus was there, but it's clear that the female immune system does know that there are different antigens present, paternal antigens. It's just that the regulation changes. So in that model, I don't know how valuable the self-concept really is in immunology. But it is a handy way of explaining what's going on. And I think immunologists, the work is so technical, and many people find it so alienating that to have a lovely metaphor like self and non-self discrimination is something that I think I would be reluctant to let go of it if I was an immunologist.
Very true. That's what we do. Most of the immunologists are struggling.
Yeah.
What is non-self?
But I do wish that evolutionary thinkers in this area would take up these immunological questions more deeply, because the problems that immunologists are dealing with are very difficult, and I think would be very enriching for the evolutionary accounts.
The other point which I just found is the micro part. Because over the last maybe 5 years, we have come to know more about the microbes. They are all over, we knew that. But now I think the human microbiome project is on really says that human microbes and my microbes are not the same. And as you said, we are all surrounded by before and normal. So I think that component of the microbe cannot completely dissociate. It's there. It's there during pregnancy, it's there during birth, it's there during life. So I think we have to take that more seriously, that that's going to be impacting on self, non-self. So it's not just your genes, but also your microbes.
Yeah.
Self and non-self concepts can be done.
And my understanding is that some of the flora in the vaginal ecosystem, even slight changes in it can have an effect on pregnancy outcome. So that's sort of new work that they're looking at, and that changes the dimensions of evolutionary concern there too.
On the subject of the blurring of the self and non-self, let me just mention that Marta's thesis was called The Indiscrete Self. Another question. Yes, Carolyn.
So, thanks, Marta. You focus quite a bit on this idea of epistemic trust.
Yeah.
I assume you mean by that so you mean trusting in others' knowledge, others as knowers.
Yeah, whereas agents of testimony.
Okay. So I was just a little unclear about why the emphasis on that, given the problem, particularly the problem in immunology. I mean, how would sort of greater epistemic trust and trustworthiness help to deal with that? This problem of reproductive immunology being
Yeah, I certainly can be clearer about that. And this is part of the rough working thesis. But I'm looking at that as a way of changing the related implicit biases that may exist concerning our beliefs about our epistemic selves and the epistemic environment. And if we can, chip into those sorts of schemata, that this may have a consequent effect on how we theorize in the sciences. So we might end up, if we don't have this sort of schema operating, being able to notice social factors to a greater extent. And when we can notice that, we can see that things like women's sexual behavior, if they have lots of social relationships, that this is going to impact the evolutionary story. We're not just dealing with one woman and one man engaged in this evolutionary conflict with each other, either in terms of resources or immunological conflict, that what we're actually doing is looking at a whole community of relationships where the children are taken care of by other people in the community as well, and everybody contributes to resources and all that good sort of stuff. I mean, in some ways I'm going back to a very old-fashioned problem. Philip Kitchering, Vaulting Ambition in the mid-'80s, pointed out that, I think it was blue jays or something. If you try to do these sort of sociobiological calculations with blue jays, it turns out to be really complex. It's not this really simple, lovely, easy evolutionary model. And I think it's problematic that, as extensive as the work is, and for example, Thornhill and Gangstad's account, that this parental investment model has a primacy that it does. And I think it paints a sort of very individualistic, conflict-ridden picture of things that is very compelling, but for some, but it's sort of compelling in the way that certain laws of physics are. They're true in the abstract, in the idealized sense, but when you actually work in reality, it's a whole lot more complicated. So.
Next question, Julian.
It's a question about this is a side kind of question, but
I'm sorry, what kind of
question?
question?
So it's a little to the side of
Oh, okay, yeah.
in direction. But it's about the danger. I wonder if you can help me understand better the difference between the self not self picture and the danger not danger picture.
Yeah.
Because it's immediately attractive, right? But it seems like the concept of danger asks you to say danger for whom, right? I mean, there is danger is sort of relative somewhat,
right?
And so it seems as though the notion of danger immediately invokes a self, danger to attach to.
Yeah. I guess the question is what kind of self does it invoke? How defined are the boundaries of that particular self? And I think it certainly relaxes those boundaries. For example, we don't react to most of the food that we eat. It's not dangerous, but it is non-self. Some of Matzinger's original examples concerned proteins that are produced in the body for the first time, well past the point at which immunological tolerance to them can be invoked. So, for example, breast milk proteins that the body hasn't encountered before. The body doesn't regard those as dangerous, and yet they're new. So, if self-non-self discrimination had been set in stone by the time we're born or whatever it is that happens, then we'd probably attack breast milk. And semen would be another example. If the body is making sort of discriminations based on danger signals, signals that the immune system gets when tissue is being damaged in the wrong kind of ways, when cell death is occurring that is not sort of naturally programmed cell death, but some kind of premature cell death, danger signals would be emitted and then the immune system will deal with it. And the immune system doesn't really care about establishing, delineating the boundaries of self from non-self. It cares about defense. So the kinds of biological individuality that would fit the danger model are greater, I think, than those that would fit self-non-self discrimination in a strict sense. I don't know, does that help?
Chris?
So I'm worried that this is Carolyn's question, just to repeat it. But there's a way of thinking about some of the discussion towards the end of your paper about epistemic trust as being really content independent, so that you can think of having a scientific community and saying it will be better if it's structured in a certain way, no matter what subject matter that scientific community is engaged in. Right? So you could say, if you have a different conception of your epistemic agents and you have this relationship of trust, then you're going to have a better scientific community in some sense. And that could be for any scientific field. But it seems that part of your argument was content specific, that it's not only a claim that the scientific community will be better at the structure in that way, but that for specific problems, the scientific community that has the structure will be better able to tackle those problems. So I was wondering if you could, is the second a better way of characterizing your claim? If so, why?
I actually think you characterized my position as a whole. I would want to make the argument that it's better in general for scientific inquiry, or for any kind of inquiry. But I do think that challenging that sort of hyper-individualistic schema is going to be really important for any science that deals with problems related to individuality or complexity, mutuality of interaction. So we might find these problems cropping up in other disciplines like psychology or something like that. And so we might expect the mistakes to be greater in those areas. And I think that the omission in this particular case strikes me as very big. How can we not think that infection is part of the story? And moreover, how can we realize that, yeah, it's a cost, but then just go on as though it didn't play a role in the explanation? It strikes me as quite a large oversight, and so I'm trying to sort of explain it from different avenues. And, you know, if Mary Midgley is right in her elegant little summary of individualism and its connections in contemporary evolutionary thinking, this problem is very pervasive for us, and it might be affecting a lot of things, politics and so on.
Other questions? Nick?
I'll wait for the microphone. I'm trying to figure out how the two parts of your paper work together. And I've got two models that might maybe, I'm trying to figure this out. I had one model, and then the last question maybe there's another thing that's going on. So let me ask them first, and then I have a follow-up question, depending on the answer. So I hope you get it right. I'm curious, so hyper-individualistic beliefs about ourselves as epistemic agents leads to a psychological schema. And then my suspicion is then you're saying that we apply that hyper-individualistic schema to the idea of the self in reproductive immunology, fill in the rest of the words that I'm missing there. So is it we're developing a certain idea of the self and then we're applying it to the individual, and that's why we're not considering the effects of infection, etc.? Or is the worry about hyper-individualism, to go back to the slide that had the triangle where we had 3 different disciplines, and one of your complaints there was that the disciplines weren't really interacting with each other. Is that the hyper-individualism, or is the hyper-individualism in the concept of the self?
It relates to ideas of the self and to our understanding of how things work in nature. So if you'll recall, Midgley connected the idea that we are these unities that have to be very concerned about our own safety with certain methodological approaches in science. As far as the disciplinary boundaries are concerned, that might be a reflection of it also in so far as people might tend to stay within their discipline and view it as in a sort of isolationist sense. But I think the point about the schemas is that we don't apply them to nature. Rather, we have this schema that sort of decides without our input how the epistemic world works. And because it's highly individualistic, certain things follow from that. So when we're investigating nature and talking with our scientist colleagues and philosopher colleagues, we miss things because of the way we view our own epistemic agency and how we think knowledge works in the community and that sort of thing.
So then, I guess my question is why are we privileging, in this case, epistemic agency? So I think, could we not just have the thesis that hyper-individualistic beliefs about ourselves as agents is the psychological schema that's really running throughout the discussion?
I think it's important to focus on the epistemic component. As you will recall, I talked about the not of hyper-individualism. So I think all of these areas of points of agency are working together and helping to create this problem. But I think it's important to focus on the epistemic one because I think a lot of people don't think about that particular dimension of it. You know, feminist epistemologists have worked a lot on the diversity question. We need a diversity of knowers. We need Carol Lee's work, for example, we need a diversity of knowers who make different assumptions about epistemic authority and who does and does not have it, to try and overcome gendered schema concerning who is more epistemically authoritative. And I think all of that work is important. But if we have a schema about the nature of the epistemological activity that is fundamentally hyper-individualistic, that in itself is a problem. And that's why I turned to the work in evolutionary psychology, because they're addressing that question rather directly. I mean, they're looking at the issue with students, but and also doing some work in lay epistemics, just these sorts of ideas amongst non-academics and so on. But I think they're relevant to what we as academics are doing and how we're relating to each other. So it's a way of highlighting this particular element of the problem. I'm not intending to sort of minimize the other components that are involved.
Other questions? Then I'll hope there is one more question. Andrew?
So I don't know much about reproductive immune systems, but I did notice that you didn't make a distinction between innate immunity and acquired immunity throughout.
Right.
And so I'm wondering if it's the case that your critique is more focused on the notions of innate immunity as opposed to acquired immunity, and if that perhaps would help to focus your argument a little bit better.
I don't know that would help. In part because there is more blurriness between innate and acquired immunity now than there used to be. There are some innate immune functions that seem to develop, acquire a degree of specificity, not like the specificity you find with T and B cells, but greater specificity than was previously thought might occur in the innate immune system. And there are complicated problems in innate versus acquired immunity in the case of pregnancy, which I don't know that I feel prepared to get into here. But I think your question is important, particularly with regard to the earlier material I talked about concerning primates and promiscuity, possibly to Charles Nunn's work, because there's this idea. I think we were talking a little bit about this over lunch, about sort of history, and what is the history of the organism, what kind of encounters with infectious agents have they had, and how does this change this picture? So that distinction may well play a role in improving some of the evolutionary immunological accounts of the female reproductive immune system.
Julia, again.
Not a question, but a somewhat light-hearted suggestion. So, in sort of keeping with the general analogy, part of what you're doing for an analogy, right, between the epistemic world and the immunological world, and saying that that analogy is something that we're using all the time in our So you might say that there's a parallel between the self-non-self picture in immunology and a sort of standard picture in epistemology, which is individualistic but also narrow in some other ways. Right? So you could call it the rational, non-rational picture in epistemology that emphasizes above all this division between the rational and the non-rational. All the non-rational stuff, which includes a whole lot of social stuff, is supposed to play no role in good judgment. And you could say that perhaps we should replace that simplistic and individualistic picture with a danger-non-danger view in epistemology that says that as with the danger-non-danger view in immunology, says a lot more things are legitimately, in fact, necessarily included than we thought before. But that doesn't mean there's not a distinction to draw between the ones that are dangerous and the ones that aren't. That's very crucial.
Yeah, fascinating idea. Yeah.
Any other questions? Then I will ask Eric Desjardins to thank the speaker.
Thank you, Maura, for this wonderful talk. And it's my privilege to meet you.
Oh, my goodness. Beautiful. And we'll